I can't deliver biblical truth in those relationships because my perspective is that of a straight man. And I don't know, so I just need to listen and learn, and I probably need to interact with some liberal theologians that have a different affirming view of homosexuality. And so this is how it begins to erode your faith, because we're bringing in this paradigm that just shifts the way we interact with the truth.
There seems to be a cultural awakening of wokeness, and for some, it's sort of a mystery. It's all an enigma. We're trying to figure out what it means. What are we supposed to wake up to? What have others woken to? And you're helping us to understand all of that. And you were involved in this mega thread that went viral on Twitter, and it hit my radar screen when a friend sent it to me. I read through it and I sent it to all of my friends because I was like, wow, this is connecting some dots that are really, really important. But first tell us, how did you get involved in all of these Twitter conversations? I mean, they're pretty intense. Why would you choose to spend so much time in the land of trolls?
Possibly I'm a glutton for punishment, I'm not sure. But no, I got involved in Twitter. I was an early adopter in 2007. I've been on it for a long time. But about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to see several friends that we had gone to church with begin to walk down this social justice path to progressive Christianity and then eventual apostasy in some cases through this process of deconstruction. And I heard all these terms that they were using, white privilege, white fragility, intersectionality, and I just became really curious and burdened, like, what is happening? What is going on to these otherwise solid Christians that is taking them down this path? And so as I began just researching and learning about this, I started to see some of these ideas show up in otherwise conservative evangelical churches and conferences and in different books, and just started to use my Twitter platform to kind of wave the red flag and say, hey, hold up, there's some problems here, that it's eroding people's faith.
Wow. So you noticed people's faith being eroded and all these crazy new terms flying around. And then what I read from you was this mega thread. So explain to people, what is a mega thread? And what was the thread that you were posting that got so much traction?
Sure. So on Twitter, a single tweet is 280 characters. So I find it's really helpful for writing concise, pithy, ideas, getting them out there. But if you have an idea that needs more space, you can string a series of tweets together in what's called a thread. So the thread in question was 23 tweets long, pretty long for a normal thread. And it was really answering a question that a lot of people are asking right now. And that's, why is the left so insistent on talking to our kids about sexuality?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why would other people be so insistent on talking to our kids about sexuality? I mean, that's a parent's job. The church can help us with that because we look to God's word on a subject that's so sacred. But why would others be so intent on talking to our children about sex? Not just healthy sex ed that you and I think of from school, but this is like a full indoctrination through social media, and it even appears to be creating a wedge between parents and children. What do you think about that?
It's really something we're seeing in our classrooms. This really all erupted with some legislation in Florida that some people on the left were just livid about, that all it did was ban instruction on sexuality and gender identity in K through 3rd grade classrooms, which later polls showed that even 60% of Democrats supported in Florida. But the left's reaction to this really just left a lot of people like, what is going on? Why is this happening? And my thread tried to answer that question, and it really all goes back to a guy by the name of Paulo Freire, who in the 1960s wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And pedagogy is just a fancy name for education. And in that, he taught that education was an inherently political act. He said that teachers are either promoting the oppression, or they're perpetuating the oppression of society by teaching the received knowledge from previous generations, or they're teaching to awaken a critical consciousness in students. And he said that was the purpose of education, to awaken a critical consciousness. We might call that being woke. And so in the 80s and the 90s, his educational philosophy became the predominant, most influential philosophy of education in American schools of education. And so we've had several generations now, or several decades, of teachers that were taught and administrators that were taught this philosophy have been seeded into our schools. And so they believe that teaching is all about creating little social justice activists.
And certainly education is critically important. We understand from the Bible that we're to train up our children in the way that they should go. And so we understand that their hearts and their minds are shaped and formed by education. That's why our textbooks need to be the right textbooks. Mm-hmm. But you say that this new group of educators is actually not looking to teach our kids about reality and the way that God made the world, but to turn them into little revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that? You're not talking about Revolutionary War characters like George Washington, Yankee Doodle Dandy. You mean something entirely different.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it would be great if there was a resurgence of learning about the founders and teaching the principles of liberty and freedom. But this is more along the lines of a Marxist revolution. This has roots in Marxist philosophy. So it's very much about tearing down what exists, the systems in place that they believe are oppressive.
It might seem really far-fetched for some people to think that there is an active agenda that is seeking to overthrow the ideas of this country, and that one of the ways that that's going to be accomplished is by separating children from their parents and separating children's values from the church and the Bible. I mean, is that overthinking it, Josh, or do you think that's really what's going on?
Yeah, I think that is what's going on some level. I think there are good teachers that are just trying to, teach our kids. They love the students, but a lot of them are having their empathy kind of weaponized against these kids with these programs that sound nice, but the overall agenda is very much happening. They want to take the kids, and they see anything that is reinforcing the society, the norms of society, the cultural heritage we have from the past. They see that anything that's reinforcing that is a threat to the agenda, the little activists they want to create.
And now the two issues that you've brought up in your thread and that you're saying are the real threat going on within our schools are critical race theory, also known as CRT, mm-hmm. and also gender theory. And I think a lot of us don't see the connection there, maybe not familiar that much with what either one are, but have sort of general bad vibes about them. Mm-hmm. But you say that they're actually two sides of the same coin. How did you draw that conclusion?
Yeah, so both critical race theory and gender theory, or queer theory, it could also be called, are part of, or subdisciplines of a larger academic discipline called critical theory. And so critical theory believes that every society can be divided up into groups of oppressors and oppressed that are divided along lines of race, sex, or gender, sexuality, religion, wealth, even physical ability. So any number of things, and there's academic disciplines studying each one of those.
That's all under the umbrella of critical theory?
Yes.
Okay. And what would be the purpose of trying to divide society up into these groups of you're the victim and you're the oppressor? Why would anybody try to do that?
It's really about societal transformation. They believe that our society is inherently oppressive, And going back all the way back to Marx, his solution was that we needed a workers' revolt. We needed people to recognize how oppressed they are so that they would rise up and overthrow the systems that are oppressing everyone. And these ideologies now are doing the same thing. They're trying to help the oppressed class recognize how oppressed they are, and the oppressors to recognize their oppression, their complicity with that oppression.
Some people might say that, Josh, when you talk about critical race theory or gender theory in these kinds of terms, like this is a negative transformation of society, some people might say, well, you're really getting lost on sideline issues. This isn't really about the gospel, and you're coming across as unloving. How would you respond to them?
Yeah, I think we need to recognize, and Paul tells us in Romans, that we are to not to be conformed to the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. So we need to recognize the dominant ideologies that are influencing our thinking, oftentimes without us even being aware of it. And these ideologies are rampant throughout society right now. And so as we attempt to share the gospel with people, we're going to be running into these. And I think it would be very helpful to recognize it, know how to counter it, and to explain the gospel in light of what people are thinking.
Let's go back and talk about how critical race theory, which we've heard quite a bit about in the media, is really stemming from something called critical theory. Can you give us an overview of what critical theory is?
Sure. So critical theory was formed by a group of men in the 1930s who were Marxist thinkers that were frustrated that the promised workers' revolution had not come to fruition in the West. So Marx had predicted that once workers recognized that they were oppressed, they would rise up, overthrow the dominant systems, and usher in a communist utopia. A guy by the name of Max Horkheimer, who's one of these original critical theorists, he introduced the term critical theory by comparing it to what he called traditional theory. And traditional theory was just trying to understand the world as it is. So it was just normal scientific method, let's understand the world. Critical theory, on the other hand, was trying to understand why the world is not as it should be. So right from its very inception, it had a Marxist vision for what the world should be like, and was trying to understand why we're not there already.
Okay, and the critical theory, it was what?
It's just this idea of critically analyzing the entire world around us to understand the forces that are at work to keep us oppressed, to prevent this Marxist utopia from developing, emerging. And so over the years, this project that they had has grown into like a broad academic discipline with all these various sub-disciplines that examine different areas. Foundational to them is the idea that any society can be divided into groups of oppressors and oppressed, and that those groups are determined based on along lines of like race, sexuality, gender, religion, wealth, even things like physical ability. There's even a critical theory called fat studies that critically analyzes the way that fat people are oppressed by thin people. So any binary you can imagine in society, critical theory has a study to examine it. And another foundational idea or core tenet of critical theory is that these oppressor groups always oppress the oppressed. There is no such thing as using power on behalf of others. If you are in power, you are oppressing the oppressed groups. And they believe that a society's norms, values, ideas are inherently oppressive.
Except their own ideas.
Of course.
And once an oppressor, always an oppressor. You can't get away from it. You just need to get rid of the oppressors.
Yep.
Or change them to agree with you.
Yeah. And so critical theory is all about tearing down these systems that they believe are oppressive. So that's what their version of social justice really is.
That's interesting. So is there a connection between critical theory and social justice?
There is. That's the ultimate goal of critical theory, is to bring about a just society through social justice activism that would tear down these systems, replace them with an equitable distribution of power, which, as we all know, seeing throughout history, where anytime the Marxist project has been tried, it's just not tenable. You cannot have a inherently equal society.
Tearing down a society in order to build up a new society. That's such an interesting concept. I mean, we would love to see heaven here on earth as well. We'd love to see God's principles put into action and see bad ideas put down. So I guess it really comes down to what are the good ideas and what are the bad ideas, and what's the right way to bring about transformation of a culture. And critical theory, you're saying, is ultimately about dividing people. It's splitting everybody up and getting everybody fighting against one another. And then ultimately, how do you fix the chaos according to critical theory? What do you do?
Yeah, that's where the revolution is the goal. It's if you can get people upset enough, they will rise up and overthrow the power that is controlling everything.
But then some power has to control everything all over again, or you'd have nothing but chaos. So don't you just wind up right where you started?
We do, yep. Critical theory would then say that now this group is in power and using their hegemonic power to keep everyone else oppressed. And so then the process starts again. So it's this really perpetual state of revolution that they're after.
So we talked about social justice. Isn't that a biblical concept, though? The idea of having justice in our society? Don't we want to help the poor? Isn't that part of our job, is to reach out to those who are in need and have speak up for those who don't have a voice?
Absolutely, yeah. Throughout Scripture, we see that the Lord's heart for the oppressed, for those, the poor, the widows, the orphans, and we're commanded to do our part, to love those in those situations and to use our power on behalf of the less fortunate. The problem with critical theory is in how it understands injustice and how it understands oppression.
Okay, talk about those things. How does critical race theory understand injustice?
So critical theory's understanding of oppression is that the ideas, the norms, the values that a society has are oppression. So we're not talking about, the biblical understanding of oppression would be using your power in a cruel or unjust manner. So right. You think of American slavery, Egyptian slavery.
Right, pharaohs enslaving the Jews and, right.
Exactly, so that's what most Christians would think of when we're talking about injustice or oppression. And so when critical theory or critical race theory talks about ending oppression, it sounds really good to Christian ears.
It does. We should end oppression.
Exactly. But we need to understand what they're actually talking about. So in the summer of 2020, after the death of George Floyd, the Smithsonian Institute published a website to help Americans talk about race, since we were having this national conversation about racism and racial injustice. And they published, as part of that, an infographic called I think it was the aspects and something of whiteness. And it's explaining this whole concept of whiteness and what whiteness is, this oppressive force that white culture has imposed upon and was keeping people of color oppressed. And in that, they listed out several things that made up whiteness. Among that, it was things like the Protestant work ethic, or delayed gratification, politeness, punctuality, being places on time, even the idea that Christianity was the norm, or monotheism. Like monotheism, they identified as an aspect of whiteness and white culture, which I'm sure the ancient Israelites would like a word about that. But so you have to understand that as we hear the critical race theory call to be about fighting oppression and tearing down systemic injustice, we have to ask really good questions about what is it you mean by that? Because anything on that Smithsonian list is, you find that in Scripture is praised as a good thing. And so critical theory would see things that the Bible admonishes us to do, such as discipline and responsibility, as tools of oppression.
We also hear the words lived experience and empathy being the most important things that we can feel today in regard to these issues. But you say that those emotions of empathy, compassion, understanding are being weaponized and used by critical theory to destroy our culture. What do you mean by that?
So lived experience is the idea that an oppressed person has because of their social location as an oppressed person, they have unquestionable access to knowledge, understanding of oppression. So they have a moral authority that their oppression confers to them. And so this is like I think the primary Trojan horse that brings these ideas into the church is when these topics come up. You and I would be having this conversation, and people would say, well, you guys are two white guys. You really can't be talking about this. You don't have any insight into this.
Yeah, you've never walked a mile in someone else's shoes.
Right. And so as Christians, we know that we're supposed to listen to others. We're to learn from others. We're to hear other perspectives. But critical theory takes that a step further and says that it is an unquestionable source of truth, that the truth is located in the lived experience of the oppressed. And so and beyond that, it's not just that you have to accept their understanding of the truth, you have to accept the conclusions drawn from their understanding.
That's interesting. It feels to be like you've got two different teams playing a game of basketball, but really only one of them gets to actually go out on the field and play, and they control the referees as well. So it seems like some parts of society don't get to be part of the conversation. Does critical race theory conflict with the gospel? If so, how does it?
Yeah, I believe it does. And that's due to one particular concept that critical race theory introduced, and that's the concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality would say that your level of oppression is based on how many different oppressed groups you can identify with. So a black man would be less oppressed than a black woman, because the black man is only oppressed on the one category of being black. But a black woman would be oppressed because she's black and a woman. And so they believe that there's these interlocking systems of oppression that need to be examined. And that includes sexuality. And so to fully embrace critical race theory, you have to start chipping away at your biblical sexual ethic. And so it immediately gets you into some dicey territory where you have to start tossing out parts of the Bible that don't align with critical theory.
That's fascinating. And so you're suggesting that critical race theory is actually teeing up something else, which is gender theory, and that the two actually are two sides of the same coin. Why? How is that? How does critical race theory pave the way for gender theory?
Sure. So when someone embraces these ideas from critical race theory through intersectionality and seeing how all the different oppressed groups are oppressed differently, you have to begin asking questions of like, okay, if I can't speak into this, if I can't talk about these issues as a white man, because I don't understand the social location of the oppressed, the lived experience of the
who are oppressed.
Right. As a Christian, that sounds good when we're talking about race. But then once we bring up the subject of sexuality, well, if I'm going to be consistent, I can't speak into the life of, a gay friend because I don't know his experience. I can't deliver biblical truth in those relationships because my perspective is that of a straight man. And I don't know, so I just need to listen and learn, and I probably need to interact with some liberal theologians that have a different affirming view of homosexuality. And so this is how it begins to erode your faith, because we're bringing in this paradigm that just shifts the way we interact with the truth.
And the theory of critical theory is that somehow all of this turmoil and this separating into groups and the fighting is somehow going to produce a utopia in society?
That's the plan. I think sometimes I think that the whole goal is perpetual revolution, because angry, divided populace is very easy to exploit.